She stood on my front porch wearing a red gown and a smile that told me she thought she had already won. My hands were resting on my stomach, 7 months along, tired, swollen feet, the kind of exhausted that settles into your bones when you're carrying a life inside you and holding your marriage together at the same time. And there she was. The woman my husband had chosen. Standing at my door. Like she had every right in the world to be there. She didn't come to apologize. She didn't come to explain. She came holding a manila folder pressed against her chest, sunglasses pushed up on her head, perfume so sharp it reached me before she even opened her mouth. She looked me up and down the way people look at something they've already decided doesn't matter. And then she smiled, not the kind of smile that greets you, the kind that tells you the game is already over. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that for 17 years before I ever became a wife, before I ever became a mother-to-be standing barefoot on that front porch, I had been something else entirely. Something they never bothered to find out. And that oversight was going to cost them everything. Before we get into this, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Caroline Hayes. I grew up in Fayetteville, North Carolina, which most people know as a military town, the kind of place where the sound of helicopters overhead feels as normal as birdsong. My father was Army, my mother was a registered nurse, and discipline wasn't something we talked about in our house. It was something we lived. Dinner was at 6. Beds were made by 7 in the morning. You didn't leave a job halfway done, and you didn't walk away from hard things just because they were hard. That was the foundation of everything I became. I enlisted at 21, after 2 years of college that left me restless and underfed in ways I couldn't fully explain. I needed structure. I needed purpose. I needed to feel like the things I was doing actually mattered. The military gave me all three. By 26, I had been selected as one of the first female instructors to work alongside the Naval Special Warfare Training Command, not as a SEAL myself, because combat roles for women were still being formally opened during that period, but as a close-quarters tactics and psychological resilience instructor. For 17 years I trained men who were trying to become the most elite soldiers in the world. I taught them how to stay calm when their heart rate was at 180. I taught them how to read a room for deception in under 4 seconds. I taught them how to recognize danger before it had a name. And then I retired, came home to Virginia, started a real estate investment company with a business partner I trusted, and met a man named Marcus Hayes at a friend's dinner party in the fall. He was charming in the way that some men know how to be, attentive, thoughtful, the kind of man who remembers what you said 3 weeks ago and brings it back into conversation like it was the most important thing he'd heard all year. We dated for 2 years. We got married in a small ceremony on a Saturday in October with 23 guests and a peach cobbler instead of a wedding cake because that was what I wanted. I was 42 years old, I had spent 2 decades in service, and I thought I had finally found the one quiet, beautiful thing I had earned. I was pregnant within the year. And somewhere in that same year, everything I thought I had built began to quietly come apart at the seams. The signs were there. I need to be honest about that. They were there long before that woman showed up at my door. There were nights Marcus came home late and the explanation was slightly different each time. First it was the office, then a client dinner, then a friend from out of town. There were weekends he left for what he called networking trips and came back distracted, his phone always face down on the counter. There was a distance in him that I had chalked up to stress, to the adjustment of becoming a first-time father at 45, to the pressure of his consulting business. I gave him the benefit of the doubt every single time. Not because I was naive. But because I was exhausted and pregnant and I wanted my marriage to be real. But there was one morning, about 4 months into my pregnancy, when I came downstairs before sunrise because the baby had been pressing on my ribs all night, and I found Marcus on the back porch on a phone call he didn't hear me come outside for. He was speaking quietly, but I caught fragments. He said, "She doesn't know anything yet." He said, "Just give me until after the baby." He said, "I'm handling it." Then he turned and saw me standing there in my robe, and something moved across his face, not guilt, exactly. More like recalculation. He smiled, told me it was a work call, came inside, made me tea, and asked how I was feeling. And I stood there in that kitchen in the dark, one hand on my stomach, and I made a decision that a younger, less trained version of me might not have made. I decided not to confront him. Not yet. I decided to watch. Can you imagine standing in your own kitchen, carrying your husband's child, and having to make that calculation? Can you imagine having to treat your marriage like a surveillance operation? I want you to sit with that for a moment, because that is where this story really begins, not on the porch with the folder, but in that kitchen, before sunrise, when I realized the man I married was lying to me about something I didn't yet have a name for. Her name, I would later find out, was Renee Dalton. She was 34 years old, worked in commercial real estate, and had been seeing Marcus for at least 14 months, which meant the affair had started about 2 months after I told him I was pregnant. She was polished. She was smart. She had a LinkedIn profile that looked like a highlight reel and a wardrobe that said she had never once apologized for taking up space. And based on what she said to me that afternoon on my porch, she genuinely believed she had the upper hand in whatever confrontation she had come to have. What she was holding in that folder, and what I could see the edge of from where I stood, was not just evidence of their relationship. It was something else. Something that made the hair on my arms rise the moment she said, with a perfectly composed expression, "I think you should take a look at some things before you make any decisions about your future." She said it like she was doing me a favor. She said it like she felt sorry for me. She said it like she knew something I didn't. She was right about that last part. She did know something I didn't. But she had made a critical, irreversible error in assuming that I was the kind of woman who would stand at her own front door and simply receive that information without doing anything about it. I looked at her for a long moment. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I stepped back and I said, "Why don't you come inside?" And the look on her face shifted, just slightly, because she had been prepared for tears. She had been prepared for a scene. She had not been prepared for calm. She sat down at my kitchen table like she owned the room and she laid the folder open in front of me. Inside were printed documents, bank records, what appeared to be property transfer forms, and a letter on legal stationery. She let me look at them for a moment and then she said, "Marcus has been protecting you from knowing how bad things actually are. The business is failing, Caroline. Your business partner has been diverting funds for almost 2 years. And Marcus has been trying to restructure things quietly to protect what you built together." She paused. "We've been trying to find a way to tell you without," and she gestured vaguely at my stomach, "without adding stress to your situation." I looked up from the documents. I said. She nodded, like that was a perfectly normal thing to say. "Marcus and I have been working through this together." I looked back down at the papers. My mind was very still and very clear, the kind of stillness that comes from 17 years of learning how to think under pressure. I was reading those documents the way I had once been taught to read an interrogation transcript. Not for what was being said. For what was being arranged. And what I saw, if you knew how to look, was not evidence of my failing business. It was evidence of a transfer. Multiple properties that were in my name alone, properties I had purchased before Marcus and I were married, properties that were my financial foundation, showed title transfer signatures dated over the previous 8 months. My signature. On documents I had never signed. And at the bottom of each page, as a witness, was the name of my business partner, a man named Douglas Farrow, who I had known for 11 years and trusted without question. I closed the folder. I looked at Renee Dalton. And I said, "Thank you for bringing these to me." She seemed surprised by that. She had expected anger. She had expected me to break down, to be overwhelmed, to be too emotional and too pregnant and too blindsided to think clearly. Instead I poured her a glass of water, I sat back down, and I said, "Tell me everything you know." She told me more than she should have. That was her second mistake. People who believe they are in control of a conversation almost always talk too much. She told me that Marcus had been consulting with Douglas for months about how to restructure the company in a way that would protect their assets from what she described as my emotional instability during the pregnancy. She told me that Douglas had found a way to move the properties through a limited liability company that he controlled. She told me that Marcus had power of attorney documentation that he planned to invoke when the time was right. And she told me all of this in the tone of someone who thought she was giving me a gift by being honest with me, which meant she believed that knowing this information would break me rather than equip me. She was wrong about a great many things that day. But that particular miscalculation was the one that undid all of them. The moment she left, and she left believing she had planted the seed of my devastation, I sat at that table for 4 minutes exactly. I know it was 4 minutes because I counted. Then I got up, I went to my home office, and I started making calls. The first was to a former colleague, a retired JAG attorney named Patricia Webb who had worked military fraud cases for 20 years. The second was to a contact at the Virginia Department of Professional and Occupational Regulation, where real estate license fraud is investigated. The third was to a private forensic accountant I had used once before on a business deal that had felt off. And the fourth, the one I made last, the one that cost me the most, was to Marcus. I told him Renee had come by. I told him it had gone well. I told him she had been very helpful. I heard the relief in his voice and I felt something in my chest go very cold and very quiet. He said, "I'm glad she could explain things." I said, "She explained everything." I told him I loved him and I hung up the phone. I want to stop here and ask you something, and I want you to really think about this. If you were 7 months pregnant and you discovered that your husband, your business partner, and your husband's girlfriend had been quietly forging your signature, transferring your property, and planning to leave you financially devastated before your child was even born, what would you do? Would you confront them immediately? Would you break down? Would you feel so betrayed that you couldn't think clearly? Because I think most of us would. I think most people in that situation would be so consumed by the emotional weight of it that the practical response would take days, maybe weeks, to come. I had 17 years of training that made a different response possible for me. But I want you to understand, that training didn't make it hurt less. It just meant I could hurt and act at the same time. Patricia Webb called me back within an hour. I sent her photographs of every page in Renee's folder. She called me back 20 minutes later and said 3 words. "This is fraud." She told me that forged property transfer documents are a first-degree felony in Virginia. She told me that invoking power of attorney under false pretenses carries criminal liability. She told me to not touch anything in the house, not confront Marcus, and not move any money. She told me to come to her office the next morning and bring everything I had access to. And she told me, and this is the part one still think about, even now, she told me, "Caroline, whoever did this assumed you would be too overwhelmed to respond quickly. Your job right now is to prove them wrong." Over the next 3 weeks, with Patricia leading and her network of investigators supporting, a picture emerged that was far worse and far more organized than I had imagined sitting at that kitchen table. Douglas Farrow had not acted alone. He had a relationship with a title company in Northern Virginia that had processed 6 fraudulent transfers over an 18-month period. That title company had a manager who had been bribed. That manager had a connection to a small investment group that had been purchasing distressed properties at below-market rates, properties that included 3 of mine, and flipping them within 90 days for significant profit. Marcus had not orchestrated the scheme, but he had known about it for at least 5 months and had said nothing to me, which under Virginia law made him complicit. And Renee Dalton, it turned out, was not just a girlfriend. She was a licensed real estate agent who had facilitated 2 of the 6 transfers and stood to collect a commission from the investment group once the dust settled. It was not a crime of passion. It was not a man having an affair and making poor decisions. It was a coordinated plan, built on the assumption that I was an emotional, vulnerable, pregnant woman who could be managed, overwhelmed, and left behind. 6 months later, and I want you to hold this moment because this is the part that still takes my breath away when I say it out loud, Douglas Farrow was arrested at his office on a Tuesday morning by federal agents. The title company manager was arrested the same afternoon. 2 members of the investment group were indicted on wire fraud and money laundering charges. Renee Dalton surrendered her real estate license and entered a plea agreement. And Marcus Hayes, my husband, the man I had married on that Saturday in October with the peach cobbler and the 23 guests, was charged with 1 count of fraud by omission under Virginia Code and faced a civil suit for breach of fiduciary duty as a spouse. He called me the night before his arraignment. I answered. He didn't say much at first, just sat on the line breathing the way people breathe when they don't know where to start. Then he said, "I didn't think it would go this far." And I said, "I know." Because I believed him. I believed he had told himself it was manageable, temporary, that he would fix it before it got to this point. That is what people who make these choices usually tell themselves. They don't imagine standing on the other side of what they built. He asked me how the baby was. I told him she was healthy. There was a long silence. He said, "I'm sorry, Caroline." I said, "I know that too." And then I said goodbye, and I meant it in the fullest possible sense. Our daughter, Eleanor Rose Hayes, was born 11 days later. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, a full head of dark hair, and the most ferocious scream I have ever heard in my life, and I have heard a lot of screaming. She was perfect. She was whole. She was entirely and completely mine. I held her in that hospital room with Patricia Webb sitting in the chair beside me, and I thought about everything that had tried to come before this moment and failed. And I thought about that woman on my porch in the white blazer who had been so certain she had already won. And I thought, this is what winning actually looks like. Not a confrontation. Not a scene. Not a moment of revenge that could be replayed later. Just this. A child in my arms. A case closed. A life rebuilt. There is something I want to say to anyone who might be watching this and feeling a version of what I felt, that specific, terrible feeling of being in the middle of your own life and realizing that the people closest to you have been rewriting it behind your back. That feeling that the ground you were standing on was never as solid as you believed. That feeling of betrayal that isn't just personal, it's structural. It reaches into everything. The photos on the wall. The plans you made. The future you thought you were building together. I want to say to anyone who knows that feeling, the people who built the trap were counting on it breaking you. They were counting on the weight of it being too much to carry while also moving forward. What they never consider is that grief and action are not mutually exclusive. You can be devastated and still be dangerous. You can be heartbroken and still be precise. I am not suggesting everyone has 17 years of naval training to fall back on. Most people don't. But every single person has something in them that knows how to survive. And the most important thing you can do in the moment that everything falls apart is refuse to let the shock of it convince you that you are helpless. You are not helpless. You are surprised. And surprise and helplessness are not the same thing. Patricia Webb framed the civil suit, recovered 2 of the 3 properties in full, and reached a negotiated settlement on the third that left me financially stable and Eleanor provided for. Douglas Farrow was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. The investment group paid restitution. Marcus received a suspended sentence and a civil judgment that will follow him for years. Renee Dalton never worked in real estate again in the state of Virginia. And I opened a new company. Smaller. More careful about who I partner with. I have a daughter who just turned 1 year old and who has her father's eyes and my mother's stubborn jaw. I have a home that is mine in every sense of the word. And I have a life that I built once and can build again, because I know now, with a certainty that nothing can undo, that the building was always the part one was good at. I want to ask you one more thing before we close. If this had happened to you, if you were 7 months pregnant, and your husband's girlfriend came to your door holding documents she thought would break you, what would you have done? Take a moment and tell us in the comments. Not just what you think you would do, but what you hope you would find in yourself in that moment. Because I believe the answer says something true about who you already are. And I believe more people than we realize have that capacity for quiet, precise, devastating resilience. They just haven't needed to find it yet. Eleanor was born healthy. The house is mine. The case is closed. And that woman in the white blazer? She learned something that day that no one ever taught her, because no one who had met me before had ever needed to. She learned that you cannot win a game you don't understand, against a woman you have never bothered to know. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from. Today's warm shout-out goes to Jocelyn from the United States, Wanda from Georgia, and Juliet from Jamaica. Thank you for being part of this family. We see you, and we're grateful for you. Subscribe now so I can welcome you by name too.